This is Melinda Roy and Shruti here. Hi Deborah, how are you? We can't hear you. Your audio is low. No, we cannot hear your voice. Could you please connect to audio and talk? Please check your audio settings once. Can you check your mic just beside camera? No, we can't hear you. No, we cannot hear your voice. Okay, you can hear us. Okay, got it. And then it's your mic. Please check your audio settings. Yeah, I will tell you the step-by-step procedure to turn on your audio. Okay. So beside camera, you can see a mic, right? So is that enabled? Click on that. Yes. Now click on that. Yeah. Okay. Click on the two buttons, which is beside CC. Two lines, right? You can see. Yeah, you turn off your camera. Yeah, let's wait for Deborah. She is fixing her audio. Deborah, are you still with us?
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I had set it all up and then it stopped working.
That's
so hello.
okay. That's okay. No problem. So how are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you.
So before getting your session started, I would like to introduce your profile to the audience. So Deborah S. Greenhunt is here. Welcome Deborah on stage. So Deborah S. Greenhunt, PhD, is an international speaker, author, educator, and three-time family caregiver. Passionate about helping family caregivers, she shares her experience in her book, The Rational Caregiver, an Amazon bestseller, providing a framework for rational caregiving. With a career in consulting and training, Deborah developed and delivered communication, problem solving, and TQM facilitation skills to corporations, government services, and economic organizations across North America and Western Europe, as well as fostering literacy improvement in K-12 schools. She holds a BA from Middlebury College and a PhD from Rutgers University. A prize winning poet, she authored The Hodge's Wife, an award winning novel about the impact of untreated mental health issues within a family. Her first book was a study of British poetry about women and silence in the era of Queen Elizabeth. Deborah also teaches memorial writing at the Rutgers University Osho Online Learning Institute and is listed in Who's Who in America 2024 to 2025. Yeah, that was a great introduction of Deborah. You can start your presentation, Deborah. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you. One moment. So, welcome to the Sharegiver Mindset. I am interested in this topic because, partly due to personal experience and additional research I've done, I feel a strong need to empower family caregivers. That's anyone who is taking care of a loved one. Now, I had three major experiences, as you just heard. My dad was the first, and then my husband, and more recently, a partner who declined from Alzheimer's dementia. I have a strong commitment to this topic. And my commitment to speaking about it began when my partner's doctor advised me very caringly that I couldn't do this alone. And until that moment, I really hadn't thought about it. I had been exhausted caring for both my husband and my father, but I hadn't thought about what I could have done instead. I simply dove in whenever the need arose. So I've always been what I call a sharegiver, which is my word for pitching in. But I didn't really understand the gravity of need for solutions before I became a life coach and a caregiver advocate. So I wanted to think a bit about mindset as we're getting started. It's lovely to meet you all today, and I'd like to know where you stand in terms of caregiving. So in the chat now, could you type a 1 if you're a caregiver? And then you could type a 2 if you have ever been a caregiver. Or a 3 if you think you will be a caregiver one day. Or a 4 if you think you'll ever need a caregiver. Now, a lot of people think they will never need a caregiver, but the fact is, we have all needed one at least once in our lives already because most of us started out as babies, I think. So, caregiving is pretty fundamental to civilization. In fact, there's a story going around about that was allegedly given by Margaret Mead when she was asked what her first indication that there was civilization was and how she would know. She pointed allegedly to a femur bone that was discovered from 15,000 years ago that uh, had healed. And she said that this couldn't have happened unless someone helped that person. And I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure there are a lot of healed femur bones. However, it turns out that Margaret Mead herself never said this, even though many scholars and many scientists and many others have pointed to this story as evidence of civilization. It talks about human endurance, and it's a story that we like very much because we seem to want and need caregivers. So we're not anxious to give up on the idea. Now, I have some good news and some bad news about caregiving. So I'll give you the good news first. The good news is that it's if you do it part-time, say about 20 hours a week, then you are on to some aspect of well-being and satisfaction, and those are the kinds of feelings that people report when that is happening. But the bad news is that as we edge up to full-time, what we call a 24/7 365 commitment, things get a little bit bad, and they go from bad to worse very quickly because of the stress that's involved in never having a break or a respite or being able to find someone else who can help you. And it's surprising to me as I go around, one of the first things people mention is that their family often says, no, they can't help. And since you're doing it, they're not going to do it. In fact, I even had people tell me that I was doing God's work, and I found out that that meant they were saying internally, thank God you're doing it so I don't have to. Now, the average age of onset of caregiving for people is 42. And that's one thing. And if it happens for a few years, people can come through it. Although I myself did not come through it unscathed, I did suffer some consequences of exhausting myself when I was caring for my dad, which ended it occurred between the years of 45 and 49. I've also learned that elders who care for spouses, for example, with dementia, suffer a 63% risk of dying before the person that they're caring for. So the risks can become pretty serious. And why is that? Caregiving challenges your financial, emotional, mental, and physical well being at all levels. So the worst news is that caregiving is life shortening. And that's bad news for all of us because we all are going to need a caregiver someday. And the typical life shortening phenomena are diabetes, hypertension, and cardiac disease. So when I finished caring for my dad, I found myself with both of those conditions, two of those conditions, diabetes and hypertension. I'm hoping to avoid the cardiac disease. We draft people and we leave them alone to fend for themselves. Multi-generational families used to help, but with all of the changes in the world, many caregivers have to function solo with very limited help from other members of their families. And if it's a choice between the caregiver's life and the loved one's life, this doesn't seem a good way of preserving civilization for all of us. You can't pour from an empty cup. And I imagine you've heard that expression before. The World Health Organization says that caregivers' rights are human rights, but this is something that isn't always supported in real life. There happen to be about 1 billion disabled people on Earth at any given time. And that means another billion people are probably helping to care for them. So, about 20% of the population has to be engaged in caregiving as either a recipient or a giver at one point. And we depend on people's selflessness to do that. Most caregivers for families are unpaid. And in the US, that amounts to $660 billion in unpaid labor contributed to the gross national product every year. So that's a pretty big number. All of those are pretty big numbers. And yet we're not doing very much to help caregivers. Recently, some grants have been made available for people below the poverty line or in various economic situations, but states have already given up some of those programs as the funds became a bit scant. So we're in a crisis, even though we're not talking about it. Now, in order to figure out what we could do about this or what caregivers need to do for themselves, I looked at famous, revered caregivers and I started thinking, well, what did they do that was different? And one person who came to mind was Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa did not go out and care for thousands of people by herself. What she did was develop successful networks of people who did the caring, who managed the systems, and who worked together to make it work. And what I'm talking about here is smart management. I don't mean stop caregiving, but I do mean manage more and do less. Yet, if you pick up resources for caregivers, you're often going to find they consist of ways to be able to do more themselves. And that is really not a solution if we look at the health consequences of this. So, one of the things we have to learn, and some of us forget we even know how to, is to delegate. We need to require others to help us, and we need to exhibit the capability of delegating. I talk about it as managing more and doing less because I believe that most of us start from the heart. And the problem is, our brains should be the first place that we look for solutions while we are family caregivers. I'm including the idea of sharegiving here, that individuals can help one another. And certainly we experience sharegiving in organizations. There are clothing drives or soup kitchens. We band together to develop food banks, but we're not seeking the caregivers themselves in order to help them. So unless you're in an organization that does, you're probably going to find it difficult to find colleagues to whom you can delegate. And I often get the panic call late at night that says, "Can you help me? I really don't know who can help. I don't know where to turn. Are there any organizations in my state or my county? Or there someplace I can look?" So I help people turn to the internet for some very good solutions because many departments of aging or divisions of aging have set up organizations that will help people, at least to get started. But I think one of the big problems is that we forget that we know how to manage because the heart issues tend to overwhelm our capabilities. I've known many managers who simply forgot that they knew how to manage when they walked in their parents' home to take care of an ailing parent. And I did that myself. I was a manager, I had my own business, which I happened to lose because the caregiving became so strenuous. And I recognize now that had I stepped back and said, "I'm not doing this alone," and insisted on help from family, no matter what that cost me to say or ask for, I might have done a little bit better had I been more of a manager and less of a feeling person. And I don't mean those roles are mutually exclusive, but sometimes we have to speak up for our own needs because no one else will do that. So I've mentioned families are sometimes the culprits. Sometimes agencies are overwhelmed and they're not able to come up with resources, but sometimes they can also still be helpful in terms of pointing you in a direction of somewhere else you can go. But if you don't ask, you're not going to know. I will not do solo caregiving anymore, but I do follow up on people who need help. So when my friend says to me, "I don't know how I'm going to get to my medical appointment in 2 weeks," I ask if I can help them. Or if someone is looking for a way to structure all their visits or to organize, I can step in and help them to organize. I will not do everything for anyone anymore, but I will try to help. And I like to call these intentional acts of kindness. We had a movement for random acts of kindness some years ago, but we have to make this more intentional for this system to work, or we're going to be overwhelmed. So, my motto is think to thrive because it's become clear to me that we are not going to survive if we don't put more thought into it and less automatic doing. So, I coach people on my rational caregiving system, which involves a framework for renegotiating the deal of caregiving. So, very often people plunge in, as I said, and they don't have a plan, and they also don't know when to stop. So, I focus on, first of all, getting awareness, not just of what your family member needs, but also what do you need? What kind of time do you have available truly to do this? I left my kids and my husband alone, in fact, for the first 2.5 months of caregiving that I ever did. And I wasn't able to go home. I wasn't able to see anybody because my dad's situation became very demanding. My mom had just passed away and he didn't know what to do. And I have to confess, I really didn't know what to do either. But at the same time, I lost a business and I wasn't able to pay attention to anything else. And that hardly seems like the right way to approach a work assignment as I look back at it. So I've learned a lesson about the kind of awareness you need to bring. What are your goals? What are your hopes and aspirations? And why should those completely disappear for a long period of time simply because someone else is sick? If we're creating a new patient in order to take care of one we already have, that doesn't sound like a very good system or outcome to maintain. So I start with awareness, and then I help people to figure out what they're accepting. Not that they're accepting being a caregiver wholeheartedly, whatever that means, but rather, what are you taking on? What are the things that you need to know? Also, I focus on the responsibility of it. If you take responsibility for another person's life, that's a bigger thing than you may realize at first. And I can tell you from watching my dad's heart divide in half in my car on the way to the emergency room the last time that I had no idea that it could end this way. I kept thinking, well, if I can just keep him alive for a few months and he can feel a little better about who he is and what's happened, maybe things will be okay. But I didn't expect what the final outcome was there. Now, what we're trying to achieve is grace, where we have that balance between doing and managing. And that's where I think the coaching is most helpful there. What is your balance going to be? Now, many researchers have discovered at least 10 or 20 systems that every single caregiver needs to manage. And that's things like nutrition, finance, medical and physical needs, and not just for the person you're caring for, but also caring for yourself in those matters, because you don't stop needing things simply because you're caring for someone else. And that's a hard nut to swallow if you are a caregiver by nature. And I think I was born being a caregiver because my dad was a doctor, my mom was a nurse, and our household ran that way. Everything was about caregiving. So as I grew up, I didn't know there was another way to do things. And you don't have to have medical parents to be that way. Sometimes it's just the way you are. Now, quickly, those 10 or 20 systems can become more than a 24 hour a day demand for you. So it's very important to think about managing what's going to be important. What are the priorities for today? What are the priorities for the hour and for the minute, in fact? And that's a skill that people either have or don't have, but probably have to learn very fast if they're going to be a caregiver. And the government has been helpful in terms of providing some new programs in the US, but some of them may end up causing more of a problem for caregivers. For example, we have now the idea of aging in place, where a person who is ill doesn't go to the hospital often or doesn't depend on outside resources in order for their survival. They have a caregiver at home, which is very nice, except the caregiver too is aging in place and may not have any of their needs met. So there we come up against the problem again. Another one is hospital at home. Suddenly, caregivers are expected to be paraprofessionals and medical technicians running IVs, handling blood tests, and all sorts of medical procedures that they were never trained to do, and they're not paid to do. So we can't manage by feelings alone. Somehow we're supposed to acquire all of this skill overnight. And that's really not a workable plan. Now, in years past, before the two income family, uh, we had what's called an intergenerational relationship. And I will tell you from interviewing caregivers in Southeast Asia that even there, in what we think of as third world economies, the intergenerational support is disappearing. For example, I interviewed a community of women who had survived the AIDS epidemic. Their husbands had all died from the disease, but they banded together and created a micro enterprise that fed, clothed, and college educated all of their children because everyone pitched in to either work in the enterprise or work as caregivers, and they had a pretty good system going. But the children, now very well educated, are planning to leave the village. So that sandwich that used to be there is no longer. So it's crumbling. Some future anthropologists might not find the evidence of healing in the remains of some of those villages, as it turns out. So we have to do something. So I'm thinking now that empowerment of caregivers is probably the best the best tool we have going. Many people abandon management careers and they forget, as I mentioned before, what they knew and how they were going to handle things if it were a business situation. So we need to bring that back into the caregiving situation. You can't do it with love alone, and you can't do it by yourself. You need to set up your own HR department from day one, in fact, and think about job descriptions. And it can't be that you're doing every job. That kind of company doesn't work very well. And as I did, in my experience, I had to forego seeing my grandchildren more recently when I was a caregiver for my partner and seeing my children, and that really was not working out very well. So, what we need is a thoughtful, heart saving contract. And you probably hear a lot about heart centered enterprises these days when we talk about empowerment. I think the problem is that we are too heart centered in caregiving and not enough brain centered. So I have to reverse that paradigm for this particular issue. We can turn away from the problem and say, well, caregiving is part of life, or I don't want to pay for someone else's caregiver and I don't have time to help. But is it rational to try to become selfless or unhealthy to protect someone else's quality of life? If we were to pose it that way to people, I imagine fewer people would accept the job, that it's your life or theirs. While family caregiving is work, you won't have the benefit of a human resources manager to define the assignment and protect you from unreasonable requests or demands. You won't have a payroll officer to hand you a check. And you won't have a supervisor who distributes the workload fairly. So you're going to need to be all of those things, all of those hats, wear them all yourself. And that's why it's a very good idea to make an agreement at first in which you state all the non negotiables that you have, and then try to live by it. If everyone involved who's avoiding caregiving will sign on to you. If they're not doing it, they have to help you out in some way. People have labored silently. Now, some caregivers can become whiners, which is kind of understandable if you think about the pressure. But still, non caregiving people can claim not to know how stressful it is until they try it. So we need to bring those problems back into the light. Now, I will tell you that when the day that I finished caregiving for my dad, I got the news from my physician that I had both hypertension and diabetes, and I really had to slow down. And I didn't think then about who could help me. But when I recently took care of a partner whose family refused to help while he was declining from Alzheimer's, I learned my lesson. And I said, here is the help I need. If you're not going to do it, I can't be here anymore. Now, Rosalind Carter, who was the first lady in the United States and also a director of the Carter Caregiving Center, explained there are only 4 types of people in the world: those who are, those who have been, and those who will be caregivers. So that's why I asked you that question at the beginning, and also the people who will need a caregiver someday. If we don't share the load, we're not going to make it through. So I hope that you are using your rational brain as you continue your caregiving, and certainly reach out to me if I can help you in some way to recenter your universe so that the caregiving does not become your source of mortality. If you have any questions, I would enjoy answering those now. And I want to complete that mindset exercise. Will you think of someone today that you can offer help to and write down what you can offer and how long it will take from your day? If you add it in the chat, that would be great. And I hope you'll commit to doing this within the next 30 days. So now I'd love to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for the enlightening speech today. So we do have a question from our audience. What are your future goals as an author and educator?
My future goals as an author and educator. Well, I have another book coming out later this summer about principles for caregivers to help make that management issue more specific for people so they learn how to do it. And as an educator, I hope to spread this message far and wide around the world to as many people as I can find, because we can't do it without caregivers, and yet we're creating a condition where we're not going to have them.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for the great explanation. And so we are hoping to join our future conferences as well, and also join our next session and encourage our next speakers as well. Thank you so much for joining this Global Virtual Summit 2024. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.